I came home expecting a quiet evening, but instead found every last thing I owned dumped in the garage like garbage waiting for pickup. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway with that smirk she wears when she thinks she has finally won, saying, "You don't live here now, my dad needs the room." For a moment the world went silent, not because I was shocked, but because I had never seen someone so confident in their own cruelty. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Then I guess I'm taking out one more piece of trash." Her smile faltered just a little, and that was the moment everything shifted. She thought I was the quiet, predictable father-in-law who stayed out of the way. She thought throwing my belongings into a dusty garage would break me. She had no idea she had just opened a door she would never be able to close. What she did not know was that this house, this life, this family had more history and more secrets than she could ever imagine, and the power she thought she was taking was never hers to begin with. As I stood there surrounded by boxes of my things, I made a silent promise. If they wanted me out of their way, they were about to learn exactly what happened when the man they underestimated decided to stop being polite. This story will not unfold the way they expect. What comes next will shake the foundation of everything they think they control, and by the time the truth comes out, there will be no doubt about who really holds the power. My name is Leonard Blake. I'm 68 years old, a retired carpenter who spent 40 years building homes for other families while trying to hold my own together. When my wife Eleanor passed 3 years ago, I thought the hardest chapter of my life was behind me. I was wrong. That Tuesday afternoon began like any other. I drove home from the florist with a small bundle of white lilies in the passenger seat, the same flowers Eleanor used to keep on our kitchen windowsill. Every week since she passed, I brought fresh ones to her memorial corner in the living room. It was my way of talking to her, of pretending she was still waiting for me at home. Some habits are too precious to break even when they break your heart. I noticed something was wrong before I even pulled into the driveway. At first I thought the garbage collectors had been careless. There were bags and boxes scattered across the concrete spilling onto the lawn. But as I parked and stepped out of the car, my chest tightened. Those were not garbage bags. Those were my clothes, my books, my toolbox, the one my father gave me when I finished my apprenticeship 50 years ago. I walked slowly, the lily still clutched in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My winter coat lay crumpled near the garage door. A box of photographs had been upended, memories scattered like leaves after a storm. And there, lying broken on the concrete, was Eleanor's rocking chair, the one she sat in every evening while we watched the sunset together, the one I had built for her with my own hands when we were newlyweds. Someone had thrown it out like it meant nothing. I knelt down and touched the splintered wood, my fingers tracing the curve I had sanded smooth decades ago. That was when I saw it. Our wedding photo torn cleanly in half, Eleanor's face separated from mine. 43 years of marriage ripped apart and tossed into a pile of trash bags. The front door opened and Vanessa stepped out onto the porch. My daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed, her face arranged into an expression I'd seen too many times. It was the look she wore when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "This house needs space for people who contribute," she said, her voice flat and final. "The garage is all you deserve now." Behind her, half hidden in the doorway, stood my son Caleb. He was pale, his eyes fixed on the ground, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like a boy caught in a lie, not a 38-year-old man watching his father be thrown out like yesterday's newspaper. He didn't speak. He did not move. He didn't meet my eyes. I stood up slowly, the torn photograph still in my hand. Something inside me wanted to shout, to demand answers, to remind them both that I had helped buy this house, that I had held Caleb in my arms the day he was born, that I had loved this family with everything I had. But I didn't shout. I didn't beg. Instead, I looked at Vanessa with a calm that surprised even me. I felt it settle over my shoulders like a coat I had forgotten I owned. She expected tears. She expected pleading. She expected me to crumble. "Then I guess I'm taking out one more piece of trash," I said quietly. Her smile faltered. Just for a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first faint recognition that she had miscalculated. That night, I slept in the garage on a folding cot I found behind the lawnmower. The concrete floor was cold and the smell of motor oil hung in the air. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle, thinking about Eleanor and the life we had built. I thought about Caleb, about the boy he used to be, about the man he had become. Around midnight, I remembered my document box. It was a small metal container where I kept important papers, the deed to my old house insurance documents, my marriage certificate. I had stored it in the garage months ago when Vanessa complained it was cluttering the guest room closet. I found the box behind a stack of moving crates. The lock had been forced open. I lifted the lid and felt my stomach drop. Several papers were missing. I did not know which ones yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Vanessa was planning, it had already begun. I did not sleep that night. I lay on the cot, staring at the garage ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the aluminum door, thinking about those missing papers. My mind kept circling back to the same question: how did I end up here 3 years ago? I had a home, a wife, a life that made sense. Now I was sleeping on a folding cot in my own son's garage, surrounded by boxes of belongings that had been thrown out like refuse. The answer, I realized, had been building slowly for years. I had simply refused to see it. When Eleanor died, the silence in our old house became unbearable. Every room held her ghost: the kitchen where she hummed while cooking breakfast, the garden where she spent spring mornings talking to her roses, the bedroom where I reached for her in the night and found only cold sheets. After 3 months of wandering through those empty rooms, Caleb called and suggested I move in with his family. "Vanessa thinks it would be good for everyone," he said. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad. I sold the house within 2 months. Looking back, I wonder if that was the first mistake. I gave up my foundation, my independence, my last connection to the life Eleanor and I had built. But at the time, it felt like the right choice. I wanted to be useful again. I wanted to be part of a family. At first, everything seemed fine. I fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. I repaired the fence in the backyard. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week, recipes Eleanor had taught me over 4 decades. Caleb seemed happy to have me around, and Vanessa smiled and thanked me for my help. I thought I had found my place, but the warmth did not last. Within 6 months, Vanessa's gratitude turned into expectation, and expectation slowly curdled into contempt. She began sighing when I entered the room, as though my presence itself was exhausting. She rolled her eyes when I told stories about my carpentry days, cutting me off mid-sentence to change the subject. She made comments that sounded like jokes, but landed like small knives. "You don't have to act old, Leonard. You just have to try." Gradually, she took control of everything. She decided what we ate for dinner, and my recipes disappeared from the rotation. She managed the household schedule, and my preferences stopped mattering. She handled all the finances, even though I contributed my pension and Social Security to the household expenses. When I asked where the money went, she smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. That's not your concern anymore." I told myself she was just organized. I told myself she was under pressure. I made excuses because the alternative was admitting that my daughter-in-law saw me not as family but as a problem to be managed. Caleb never said a word. When Vanessa criticized me at dinner, he stared at his plate. When she complained about the noise from my television, he suggested I watch with headphones. When she announced that my bedroom would be converted into a home office because I could sleep in the smaller guest room downstairs, he nodded along as though it made perfect sense. I kept waiting for him to stand up to defend me, to remember that I was his father. But my son had learned long ago that silence was safer than confrontation. Vanessa had trained him well. The moment I should have recognized the danger came 6 months ago. Vanessa approached me one evening with a folder of papers and a pen. She explained that these were household authorization form, standard documents that would make it easier to manage shared expenses. Her smile was warm, her voice patient, as though she were helping a confused old man understand something simple. But 40 years of signing contracts as a carpenter had taught me to read before I wrote my name. I looked at the papers more carefully. The language was dense, filled with legal terms I did not fully understand, but certain phrases stood out: power of attorney, financial authority, medical decisions. These were not household forms. These were documents that would give someone else control over my life. I told her I needed time to review them with my own eyes. Her smile tightened just for a moment before she recovered. "Of course," she said. "Take your time. There's no rush." She never brought them up again. But I filed that memory away the same way I filed away the small cruelties and the quiet dismissals. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself family did not betray family. Now, lying in the garage with my broken belongings scattered around me, I understood that I had been a fool. The missing papers, the guardianship forms, the 3 years of slow marginalization, it was all connected. Vanessa had been planning something for a long time. I just had not wanted to see it. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom inside the house. Vanessa had not bothered to lock the side door, probably assuming I would not dare to enter. I moved quietly through the dark hallway, my carpenter's instincts remembering which floorboards creaked. That was when I heard her voice drifting from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking in the low, confident tone she used when she believed no one was listening. "The papers are almost ready," she said. "Once he's declared incompetent, everything will be ours. The house, his accounts, all of it. He won't be able to fight it. Who's going to believe a confused old man over his own family?" I stood frozen in the darkness, her words sinking into my chest like stones dropped into still water. She was not just pushing me aside. She was erasing me completely. I did not confront Vanessa about what I heard. A younger man might have stormed into the kitchen demanding answers, but I had learned long ago that accusations without proof only give your enemy time to prepare. Instead, I returned to the garage, lay back down on my cot, and stared at the ceiling until morning light crept through the gaps in the door. I had survived 40 years in the construction business by knowing when to swing a hammer and when to measure twice. This was a time for measuring. 2 days later, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. I watched from the garage window as an older man stepped out, moving slowly but with a certain dignity that age had not yet stolen. He was tall and thin, with white hair combed neatly back and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen more than his share of trouble. I recognized him from photographs Vanessa kept in the living room, Ralph Hargrove, her father. Vanessa emerged from the house with a smile I had never seen her wear for me. She embraced her father warmly, took his suitcase, and led him inside as though welcoming royalty. I remained in the garage, unsure whether I was expected to greet the guest or stay hidden like the inconvenience I had become. That evening, Ralph found me. I was sitting on my cot, sorting through the few belongings I had managed to salvage when the side door creaked open. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like pain. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "She told me you wanted your own space. She said you preferred the privacy." I looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. There was no guile there, no performance. His confusion was genuine, but there was something else in his eyes too, something I recognized because I'd seen it in my own reflection. It was the look of a man who had watched Vanessa manipulate the truth before and had chosen not to see it clearly. "The garage wasn't my choice," I said simply. Ralph nodded slowly as though confirming something he had already suspected. He glanced around at the concrete floor, the folding cot, the boxes of my belongings stacked against the wall. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked back into the house, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. The next morning, I helped Ralph unpack his things in the guest room that used to be mine. Vanessa had asked me to assist, probably to remind me of my reduced status in the household. I carried his suitcases upstairs while she supervised from the hallway, her arms crossed her eyes, watching my every movement. While Ralph arranged his clothes in the closet, I noticed him pause. He was staring at something in the small wastebasket near the desk. Without a word, he reached in and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. When he unfolded it, I saw what it was. My wedding photograph, the one that had been torn in half and thrown away with the rest of my belongings. Someone had retrieved it from the driveway pile and discarded it here, perhaps thinking it would go unnoticed among the household trash. Ralph looked at the photograph for a long moment. I could see Eleanor's face in the image, young and radiant, standing beside a version of me that still believed the world was mostly fair. He said nothing, but he carefully folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. I pretended not to notice. That evening after dinner, Ralph came to the garage again. The house was quiet, Vanessa and Caleb having retired to their bedroom. He handed me the photograph without ceremony. "Some things shouldn't be thrown away," he said. "I found it upstairs. I thought you might want it back." I took the photograph and held it gently, smoothing out the creases with my thumb. Eleanor's smile looked up at me, unchanged by time, undimmed by death. I felt my throat tighten, but forced myself to speak. "Thank you," I said. "That was kind of you." Ralph sat down on an old paint bucket, his knees creaking as he lowered himself. He was quiet for a while, staring at the concrete floor as though searching for words buried beneath it. "Vanessa told me you volunteered to move out here," he said finally. "She said you were happy with the new arrangement, said you wanted independence." I let the silence stretch between us. I did not need to respond. My expression said everything. Ralph's face changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a small collapse in the set of his shoulders. But I saw it clearly. He was a man watching a familiar pattern repeat itself, a man recognizing a lie he had heard before in a different form. "I see," he said softly. He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. At the garage door, he paused, one hand resting on the frame. He did not turn around, but his voice carried clearly in the still air. "She promised me this time she wouldn't ruin anything," he murmured almost to himself. "I should have known better." Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat alone in the dim light, holding my wedding photograph, turning his words over in my mind like stones in my palm. This time, she promised this time. The words implied there had been other times, other promises, other things that had been ruined. I didn't know what Vanessa had done before or to whom, but I was beginning to understand that I was not her first victim. And Ralph, whatever his faults, might not be entirely her ally. Ralph's words haunted me through the night. This time she wouldn't ruin anything. The phrase circled in my mind like a bird that could not find a place to land. What had Vanessa ruined before? Who else had suffered at her hands? I needed answers. But I knew Ralph was not ready to give them. Whatever secrets he carried, they were buried deep beneath years of denial. I would have to find another way. The next morning, I caught Caleb alone in the backyard. He was standing by the fence, coffee cup in hand, staring at nothing. For a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered, the one who used to follow me around the workshop, asking questions about wood grain and joint construction. That boy had trusted me completely. The man standing before me now could barely meet my eyes. "Caleb," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I need to understand something. Why are you letting her do this to me?" He flinched as though I had struck him. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his grip, and I watched the steam curl upward into the cold morning air. "Dad, please," he said, his voice thin. "Don't make things worse. Vanessa knows what she's doing. It's for everyone's good. You'll see that eventually." "For everyone's good," I repeated slowly. Throwing my belongings into the driveway was for my good. Tearing up my wedding photo, making me sleep in the garage like a stray dog. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He simply stood there, shoulders hunched, refusing to look at me directly. I saw it then, the full depth of what Vanessa had done to my son. She had not just married him. She had hollowed him out, removed whatever backbone he once possessed, and filled the empty space with fear. He was not her partner. He was her instrument. "She's planning something," I said quietly. "Something worse than the garage. Do you know what it is?" For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the blank expression of a man who had chosen not to see. "I have to go to work," he muttered, and turned away before I could say another word. I watched him disappear into the house, my heart heavier than it had been in years. My son was lost to me, at least for now. If I wanted to protect myself, I would have to do it alone. That afternoon, Vanessa left for her weekly appointment at the salon. She would be gone for at least 2 hours, perhaps longer if she met friends for lunch afterward. Ralph was napping in the guest room and Caleb was at the office. The house was empty except for me. I moved quickly but carefully, the way I used to move on construction sites when safety inspectors arrived unannounced. Vanessa's home office was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a small room she had claimed shortly after I moved in. She kept it locked when she was away, but 40 years as a carpenter had taught me more than how to build doors. I knew how to open them too. The lock was simple, a basic interior mechanism that yielded to a flathead screwdriver and steady pressure. Inside the office was immaculate. A pristine desk, a filing cabinet, shelves lined with binders organized by color and label, everything in its place, everything under control, just like Vanessa herself. I started with the filing cabinet. The top drawer held household bills and insurance documents. Nothing unusual. The second drawer contained tax records and investment statements, but the bottom drawer was locked with a separate key, a small brass mechanism that required more careful work. When it finally clicked open, I found the missing papers from my document box. My Social Security card, my birth certificate, the deed to my old house, the one I had sold 3 years ago. She had taken them deliberately, gathering the pieces she needed for whatever scheme she was constructing. But beneath those papers, I found something far worse. It was a legal document thick with formal language and official seals. The header read, "Petition for guardianship of an incapacitated adult." My name was typed clearly in the designated spaces. Leonard Blake, date of birth, current address. The document described me as elderly and confused, unable to manage my own affairs, a danger to myself without proper supervision. The petition was not yet complete. Several sections remained blank, waiting for signatures and supporting evidence. But the intent was unmistakable. Vanessa was not merely trying to push me out of the family. She was trying to erase my legal existence entirely. I sat down slowly in her desk chair, the petition still in my hands. My heart was pounding, but my fingers were steady. I had spent my life building things that would stand against storms and time. I knew how to remain calm when the ground shifted beneath my feet. If this petition was approved, Vanessa would become my legal guardian. She would control my bank accounts, my pension, my Social Security payments. She would decide where I lived, what medical treatment I received, whether I could leave the house unsupervised. I would become a prisoner in my own life, stripped of every right I had earned over 68 years of work and sacrifice. The papers she had asked me to sign 6 months ago made sense now. When I refused, she had simply found another route. She did not need my signature if she could convince a judge that I was no longer capable of making decisions for myself. I placed the petition back in the drawer exactly as I had found it. I closed the filing cabinet, reset the locks, and left the office as though I had never been there. Vanessa would not know I had discovered her plan. Not yet. In the hallway, I paused by the window and looked out at the garage where I had been exiled. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. "So that's your plan," I whispered to the empty house. "Make me disappear." Legally. But I was not going to disappear, not without a fight. The knowledge of Vanessa's plan sat heavy in my chest like a stone I could not dislodge. I went through the motions of the following days, carefully keeping my expression neutral when she passed by, nodding politely at dinner, retreating to the garage each night as though I had accepted my exile. But inside, my mind was turning, constantly searching for a way out of the trap she was building around me. The nights were the hardest. October had arrived with an early chill, and the garage offered little protection against the cold that crept through the walls after sunset. I had one thin blanket, a pillow that smelled of motor oil, and the company of my own thoughts. I lay on the cot each night, staring at the exposed rafters, listening to the house settle into silence, wondering how my life had narrowed to this small concrete room. On the fourth night, I could not sleep at all. I sat up on the edge of the cot and reached for the torn wedding photograph that I kept beneath my pillow. Ralph had returned it to me, and I had smoothed out the creases as best I could, but the tear down the middle remained. Eleanor's face looked up at me, from one half young and radiant, her eyes full of the future we had believed was waiting for us. I remembered the last time I saw her conscious 3 years ago in the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading flowers. She had been so weak by then, her voice barely a whisper, but her grip on my hand was surprisingly firm. She had pulled me close, her lips brushing my ear, and spoken words I had carried with me every day since. "Don't let anyone take your dignity, Leonard. Promise me." I had promised. I had held her hand and sworn that I would stand tall no matter what came. But sitting there in that cold garage, surrounded by boxes of belongings that had been thrown out like garbage, I felt the weight of that broken vow pressing down on my shoulders. Eleanor had believed in me. She had trusted me to protect myself, and I had let a woman half my age strip away everything I was. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her photograph. "I'm trying. I just don't know how to fight this." The side door creaked open, and I quickly tucked the photograph back under my pillow. I expected Vanessa come to deliver some new humiliation, or perhaps Caleb with another hollow excuse. Instead, I saw a face I barely recognized. Margaret Holloway from next door, a woman I had spoken to perhaps a dozen times over the past 3 years, stood in the doorway holding a covered pot and a folded blanket. She was 65 with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I had always thought of her as pleasant but distant, the kind of neighbor who waved from her driveway but kept to herself. Now she stepped into my garage as though she had every right to be there, her expression a mixture of kindness and barely contained fury. "I saw you out here last week," she said without preamble. I told myself it wasn't my business, but I've been watching that woman parade around like she owns the world, and tonight I decided I was done being polite about it. She set the pot on my workbench and handed me the blanket. It was thick wool, the kind that actually held warmth, and I accepted it gratefully. "It's soup," she continued, nodding toward the pot. "Chicken and vegetables, still hot. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." "Mrs. Holloway," I began, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Margaret, and don't you dare tell me you're fine. No man should sleep in a garage in his own house. I don't care what that woman says or what story she's spinning for the neighbors. I have eyes, Leonard. I can see what's happening here." For the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was such a small thing, a pot of soup and a warm blanket, but it meant someone had noticed. Someone cared enough to act. "Thank you," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. Margaret nodded curtly as though gratitude embarrassed her. "Eat the soup before it gets cold. I'll be back tomorrow." She left as abruptly as she had arrived, but the warmth of her presence lingered. I wrapped myself in the blanket and ate the soup, slowly savoring each spoonful. It tasted like something Eleanor might have made. Later that night, Ralph appeared at the garage door. He glanced over his shoulder before entering as though afraid of being seen. His face was drawn older somehow than it had looked when he arrived. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, "about Vanessa." I waited, saying nothing. He sat down on the paint bucket he had used before, his hands clasped between his knees. "She's always been good with paperwork," he said slowly. "Better than anyone I know. Numbers, documents, legal forms. She managed finances in my brother's household too before." He stopped, his voice trailing off into silence. Before what I asked, Ralph shook his head, unable or unwilling to finish, but the implication hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. Whatever had happened to his brother's household, Vanessa had been at the center of it. The next evening, Margaret returned with more soup and something else, a manila folder filled with papers she had pulled from the county archives. She spread them across my workbench, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her finger tracing lines of text I could not decipher in the dim light. "I did some digging," she said. "Wanted to understand the situation better before I stuck my nose in any further." She paused, her finger stopping on one particular document. When she looked up at me, her expression had changed. There was surprise there, and something that looked almost like hope. "Leonard," she said slowly, "do you actually know whose name is on this house deed?" Margaret's question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. She was watching me closely, her finger still pressed against the document she had found, waiting for my response. I looked at the papers spread across my workbench, at the county records she had taken the trouble to unearth, and I realized the time for secrets had passed. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know whose name is on the deed. Mine." Her eyes widened slightly, but she did not interrupt. I settled back against the wall of the garage and told her the story I had never shared with anyone outside my immediate family. 12 years ago, Caleb came to me in crisis. He had just married Vanessa, and they were trying to buy their first home together. But Caleb's credit was damaged from mistakes he had made in his 20s, and the bank refused to approve the mortgage without a co-signer. He was desperate, embarrassed, barely able to meet my eyes as he explained the situation. Eleanor and I talked it over for 3 nights before making our decision. I did more than co-sign. I put up the down payment from our savings, and the bank required me to be listed as co-owner to secure the loan. 50% of this house belongs to me legally and irrevocably. It has been that way since the day the papers were signed. "Vanessa doesn't know?" Margaret asked. I shook my head. "Caleb handled all the paperwork. Vanessa was busy with wedding plans, and she never asked to see the deed. By the time they moved in, she assumed the house was entirely theirs. Caleb never corrected her, and neither did I." "But why?" Margaret leaned forward, genuinely puzzled. "Why keep it secret all these years?" I was silent for a moment, searching for words that could explain something I had never fully articulated even to myself. The truth was complicated. I had kept the secret partly out of pride, not wanting Vanessa to know her husband had needed his father's help to provide a home. Partly out of love for Caleb, wanting him to feel like the head of his own household, and partly out of a belief that family did not keep score, that the deed was just a formality, that it would never actually matter. "I never imagined using it against my own son," I said finally. "When I signed those papers, I thought I was helping him build a future. I didn't think I was buying myself a weapon." Margaret studied me for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're a good man, Leonard. Maybe too good for your own protection." She gathered her papers and tucked them back into the folder. Before she left, she pressed it into my hands. "Keep these somewhere safe. You might need them sooner than you think." After she was gone, I sat alone in the garage, turning the folder over in my hands. The weight of what it represented settled slowly into my bones. I owned half this house. Vanessa could not legally force me out of property that belonged to me. The guardianship petition, the exile to the garage, the systematic erasure of my presence, all of it was built on a foundation she did not know was cracked. But knowing I had legal standing was not the same as knowing what to do with it. Using that deed against Caleb would mean destroying whatever remained of our relationship. It would mean declaring war on my own son. And despite everything, I was not sure I was ready for that. I needed to think. I needed clarity. And so I did what I always did. When the world became too heavy, I reached for Eleanor. Among the boxes Vanessa had thrown into the garage were several containers of Eleanor's belongings. Things I had not been able to part with after she died. Her favorite books, her gardening gloves, the jewelry box that still held her wedding ring. I had been avoiding these boxes since my exile began, afraid that touching her things would break something inside me that I needed to keep intact. But that night I opened the largest box and began to sort through its contents. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of old photographs and a bundle of letters we had exchanged during our courtship, I found an envelope I did not recognize. It was sealed, my name written across the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice, covered in the familiar script I had loved for 43 years. "My dearest Leonard," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone and you are facing something difficult. I know you, my love. I know how you try to carry everything alone, how you put others before yourself, how you mistake patience for weakness. But you are not weak. You are the strongest man I have ever known." I had to stop reading. My eyes were blurring and my throat had tightened until breathing felt like work. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and forced myself to continue. "One day you will have to stand up for your dignity. I don't know when or why, but I know it will come. And when it does, I need you to remember something: you are stronger than you believe. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Fight for yourself the way you always fought for me." The letter ended there. No instructions, no documents, no practical weapons I could use against the threat closing in around me. Just her faith in me, expressed in words she had written years before she died. I sat with the letter for a long time, reading and rereading her words until I had memorized every curve of her handwriting. Part of me had hoped for something more concrete, a hidden account perhaps, or copies of important documents, something I could use. But Eleanor had given me something different. She had given me her belief that I could handle whatever came. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my shirt pocket close to my heart, where she had always lived. "She believed in me," I whispered to the empty garage. "But she didn't leave me weapons. She left me courage." I looked around at the cold concrete walls, at the boxes of my discarded life, at the door beyond which Vanessa was plotting my destruction. "I suppose that will have to be enough." Eleanor's letter gave me the courage I needed to take the next step. For days I had been gathering information, building alliances, waiting for the right moment. But waiting without direction is just hesitation dressed in patience. I needed a plan. And for that, I needed someone who understood the law better than I ever could. Jonathan Reeves had been Eleanor's attorney for nearly 20 years. He handled our wills, managed the sale of our old house, and guided us through the paperwork when I co-signed Caleb's mortgage. He was semi-retired now, working only a few hours each week from a small office downtown, but his mind was still sharp as a carpenter's chisel. More importantly, he was one of the few people left in this world who remembered me as I used to be before grief and manipulation had worn me down to a shadow. I called him on a Tuesday morning and asked if he had time to meet. His voice warmed immediately when he recognized me. "Leonard Blake," he said. "It's been too long. Come by this afternoon. I'll clear my schedule." His office was exactly as I remembered it, cramped and cluttered with files that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Jonathan himself had aged in the 3 years since Eleanor's funeral, his hair now completely white, his movements slower and more deliberate. But his eyes still held that keen intelligence that had made him one of the best estate lawyers in the county. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything. The garage exile, the torn photograph, the guardianship petition hidden in Vanessa's desk, the co-ownership that she did not know existed. I held nothing back, laying out the full scope of what had been done to me and what I feared was still to come. When I finished, Jonathan sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a cloth from his desk drawer. It was a habit I recognized from years ago, something he did when he was processing difficult information. "This is worse than I imagined," he said finally. "Elder abuse, financial manipulation, attempted guardianship fraud. If even half of what you're describing is accurate, Vanessa has exposed herself to serious legal consequences." "I'm not looking for consequences," I said. "I'm looking for protection." Jonathan nodded, replacing his glasses. "Let's talk about your position. The co-ownership is solid. You're on the deed. You contributed the down payment, and there's a clear paper trail. No court in this state would force you out of property you legally own. The guardianship petition is more concerning, but it's also deeply flawed. You're clearly competent. You're articulate, organized, and you've just laid out a complex situation with perfect clarity. Any judge who meets you for 5 minutes will see that petition for what it is, a fabrication." He paused, studying me with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading between lines. "But here's what I don't understand, Leonard. You've known about your ownership all along. You could have asserted your rights the moment she threw your belongings into the driveway. Why haven't you acted?" It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks. I took a deep breath and tried to put into words something I had only felt until now. "Because words from a father mean nothing to a blind son," I said slowly. "If I had confronted Vanessa with the deed that first night, Caleb would have defended her. He would have seen me as the aggressor, the bitter old man trying to destroy his marriage. She would have twisted the narrative, and I would have lost my son forever." Jonathan was silent, waiting for me to continue. "I needed him to see who she really is with his own eyes. I needed evidence, not accusations. I needed to let her reveal herself piece by piece until even Caleb could not deny what was standing in front of him." Understanding dawned in Jonathan's eyes. "This isn't about revenge," he said quietly. "You're trying to save your son." "He's still in there somewhere," I replied. "The boy I raised, the man he was supposed to become. Vanessa has buried him under years of manipulation and fear. But I have to believe he can find his way back, and when he does, I need to be standing on solid ground, not drowning in a war I started." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. For a long moment he said nothing, simply thinking through the implications of what I had shared. "Then we don't evict her," he said finally. "We don't threaten her. We don't reveal your ownership or challenge the guardianship directly. We let her continue exactly as she has been." I frowned. "I'm not sure I follow." Jonathan's expression hardened into something that looked almost like anticipation. "People like Vanessa can't help themselves, Leonard. They push until they overreach. They lie until the lies contradict each other. They manipulate until the manipulation becomes visible. If we give her enough rope, she will hang herself with it." He stood and extended his hand across the desk. "We let her destroy herself, and when she does, we'll be ready." Jonathan's strategy required something I had never been good at: performing calm while chaos churned beneath the surface. Every morning I woke in that cold garage, I had to remind myself that patience was not passivity. I was not surrendering. I was waiting. There is a difference, though. Some days it was hard to remember which side of the line I stood on. In the days that followed my meeting with Jonathan, I changed my behavior in ways so subtle that only someone watching closely would notice. I stopped avoiding Vanessa. When she passed me in the hallway, I nodded politely and wished her good morning. When she made cutting remarks at dinner, I responded with quiet agreement or gentle deflection. I asked for nothing, complained about nothing, and accepted my exile to the garage as though it were a reasonable arrangement between reasonable people. It drove her mad. I could see it in the small ways her composure began to crack. The way her eyes followed me when she thought I was not looking. The slight hesitation before she spoke, as though she was recalculating something that no longer added up. She had expected tears and begging. She had expected me to storm out of the house in humiliation or crumble under the weight of her cruelty. Instead, I greeted her each morning with the same mild courtesy, and she did not know what to make of it. The predator was confused. The prey had stopped running, and she could not understand why. One evening, about a week after my conversation with Jonathan, something happened at dinner that shifted the atmosphere in the house. We were all seated around the table, Vanessa presiding at one end, Caleb slumped in his usual chair, Ralph eating quietly with his eyes fixed on his plate. I had been permitted to join them for meals, though Vanessa made it clear through sighs and pointed silences that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Caleb was talking about work. Something about a project deadline that had been moved up unexpectedly. His voice carried that weary edge I had heard too often lately, the sound of a man running on empty. "I don't understand it," he said, pushing food around his plate. "We both work full-time. We don't overspend. We haven't taken a vacation in 2 years. So where does all the money go? Why is everything always so tight?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I kept my eyes on my plate, careful not to react, but I felt the tension spike across the table. Vanessa's fork paused halfway to her mouth just for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "The economy is difficult right now," she said smoothly. "Everyone is struggling. We're actually doing better than most families in our position." It was a masterful deflection delivered with just the right mixture of reassurance and subtle condescension. But I was not the only one who noticed. Across the table, Ralph's eyes flickered toward his daughter, then away. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but I could see the wheels turning behind his tired expression. Caleb accepted the explanation, as I knew he would. He nodded and returned to his meal, his moment of doubt already fading. But a seed had been planted. Even if he did not realize it yet, he had asked the question that Vanessa could not afford to answer truthfully. Where does all the money go? I filed that moment away alongside the others, another piece of evidence in the case I was slowly building. Jonathan had told me to let her destroy herself. What he did not say was that destruction often begins with small cracks, hairline fractures that widen over time until the whole structure collapses. 3 days later, the cracks grew wider. I was in the garage organizing my belongings when I heard raised voices from inside the house, Vanessa's voice sharp with an edge I had not heard before. She was on the phone pacing the kitchen, her words muffled, but her tone unmistakable. Something had upset her badly. Later that night, Ralph came to visit me in the garage, his face troubled. "She's been acting strange all day," he said quietly, snapping at everyone, checking her office every few hours like she's expecting something to be missing. I kept my expression neutral. "Did she say what was bothering her?" Ralph shook his head. "She called her mother this afternoon. They talked for almost an hour. I couldn't hear most of it, but I caught a few words." He hesitated, as though uncertain whether to continue. "She said something about documents, about someone moving things that shouldn't have been moved." My heart beat a little faster, but I kept my voice steady. "That sounds stressful for her." Ralph looked at me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. He knew I had been in that office. He knew I had found something. But he didn't ask and I didn't offer. Whatever loyalty still bound him to his daughter, it was fraying at the edges. That night, long after the house had gone dark, I heard voices drifting through the walls. Vanessa and Caleb arguing in their bedroom. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm was familiar. Her voice rising in sharp bursts, his murmuring in response, trying to calm her down. Then, just as the argument seemed to be fading, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The bedroom window was cracked open, and Vanessa's voice carried clearly into the night air. "Your father knows something," she hissed. "I can see it in his eyes. He's too calm, too patient. He's planning something." Caleb's response was muffled, probably a protest or a plea for reason. "No," Vanessa cut him off. "We can't wait anymore. We need to file the guardianship petition this week, before he can act first." I lay on my cot in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, her words echoing in my mind. She was accelerating her timeline. Whatever window I had for preparation was closing faster than I had anticipated. Jonathan had said to let her destroy herself, but now I wondered if she would destroy me first. The night after I overheard Vanessa's threat, I barely slept. Her words played on a loop in my mind, each repetition sharpening my sense of urgency. She was moving faster now, the predator sensing that her prey might not be as helpless as she had assumed. I needed to act, but I could not afford to act rashly. One wrong step and everything Jonathan and I had planned would collapse. The next evening, Ralph came to the garage, but this time something was different. He did not knock or call out a greeting. He simply appeared in the doorway, his face drawn and pale, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind him. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight for years and had finally decided to set it down regardless of the cost. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you the day I arrived." I gestured to the paint bucket he had used before. He sat down heavily, his shoulders hunched forward, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I let the silence stretch between us. Some confessions need time to find their way out. I've watched my daughter destroy another family before, he said finally. My brother's family. His name was Thomas. We were close once, grew up in the same house, shared everything. He had a good marriage, 2 kids, a small business that was doing well. Then Vanessa offered to help. He laughed bitterly, a hollow sound that echoed off the garage walls. She was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in accounting. Thomas was struggling with the bookkeeping for his company, and Vanessa volunteered to manage his finances. She moved in with them to make it easier, said it would only be temporary. Ralph's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Within 2 years, she had ruined them. She manipulated the accounts, took out loans in their names without telling them, redirected money into accounts they didn't know existed. By the time Thomas realized what was happening, his business was bankrupt and his credit was destroyed. His wife blamed him for trusting Vanessa. They divorced 6 months later. I felt the weight of his words settling into my chest. This was not a story of simple greed. This was a pattern, a method refined through practice. What happened to Thomas? I asked quietly. Ralph shook his head. We haven't spoken since. He blames me for raising her, for not warning him. And he's right. I saw the signs. I knew something was wrong. But I told myself she was just ambitious, just trying to help. I let my love for my daughter blind me to what she was becoming. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. His hands were shaking as he held them out to me. I kept these, he said. Emails between Vanessa and her mother from that time. I printed them years ago after everything fell apart with Thomas. I told myself I was keeping them as insurance in case I ever needed proof of what happened. But the truth is, I kept them because I couldn't let go of the guilt. I took the papers and unfolded them carefully. The emails were dated nearly 15 years ago, the formatting old and slightly faded, but the words were clear enough. The first email was from Vanessa to her mother describing her progress with Thomas's finances. She wrote about the accounts she had accessed, the loans she had arranged, the ways she had covered her tracks. Her tone was casual, almost cheerful, as though she were describing a successful project at work rather than the systematic destruction of her uncle's life. Her mother's response made my blood run cold. Men like them don't check what they sign, she had written. They trust too easily and question too late. Use it. This is how our family survives. This is how we've always survived. I read the line again, then a third time, making sure I understood what I was seeing. This was not advice given in a moment of weakness. This was instruction passed down from mother to daughter like a family recipe. Vanessa had not become a predator by accident. She had been trained. Her mother taught her this, I said slowly. It's not just Vanessa. It's generational. Ralph nodded miserably. My wife was the same way. I didn't see it until after we were married. By then I was too deep in to get out. I thought maybe Vanessa would be different. I thought maybe she would choose a different path. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment I saw him not as Vanessa's father, but as another victim. A man who had spent decades watching the people he loved hurt others, unable to stop them, unwilling to confront the truth. I looked down at the emails in my hands, at the cold calculation in Vanessa's words, and the colder wisdom in her mother's response. This isn't just greed, I said, my voice steady despite the chill spreading through my chest. She was trained to do this. It's in her blood. Ralph met my eyes for the first time since he had entered the garage. That's why I'm telling you now, he said. I couldn't save my brother, but maybe I can help save your son. Ralph's confession opened a door I had not known existed. For days afterward, we met in secret, piecing together a history that stretched back far longer than I had imagined. What emerged was not simply the story of one manipulative woman, but a pattern of destruction that had repeated itself across generations, leaving broken families and shattered lives in its wake. It began with Ralph's wife, a woman named Doris, whom I had never met. She had died 8 years ago, but her influence lived on in ways Ralph was only now beginning to articulate. He told me how they had met, how charming she had been, how quickly she had taken control of their household finances. He described the subtle ways she had isolated him from his family, The arguments that always ended with him apologizing for things he had not done, the slow erosion of his confidence until he no longer trusted his own judgment. "I thought that was just marriage," he said quietly. "I thought all relationships were like that. It wasn't until years later that I realized what she had done to me." But the roots went deeper still. As we talked, Ralph revealed something that made the pattern unmistakably clear. 30 years ago, before he married Doris, she had lived with his parents during a difficult financial period. She had offered to help manage their accounts, just as Vanessa would later offer to help Thomas. Within 2 years, Ralph's father had lost his retirement savings to a series of bad investments that Doris had recommended. His parents' marriage barely survived the strain. "My father never forgave himself," Ralph said. "He died believing he had failed my mother through his own stupidity. He never knew that Doris had been steering him toward those losses the whole time." I sat in the dim light of the garage, turning this information over in my mind. The pattern was undeniable. Doris had preyed on Ralph's father. Then she had raised Vanessa to do the same. Now Vanessa was continuing the cycle with my son and perhaps with me as well. It was not simple greed or opportunism. It was a family tradition passed down like a dark inheritance from mother to daughter. "Why didn't you stop it?" I asked. "When you realized what Doris was doing, why didn't you leave?" Ralph was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with decades of accumulated shame. "Because I was weak," he said. "I saw the warning signs. I watched her teach Vanessa that manipulation was survival, that trust was something to exploit, that love was just another tool for control. But I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I told myself that maybe I was wrong, that maybe I was the one who didn't understand. I chose comfort over confrontation. I chose peace over truth." He looked up at me, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "And now I'm watching history repeat itself. Your son is where I was 40 years ago. Trapped in a marriage he doesn't understand, losing pieces of himself every day, too afraid to question what's happening because questioning means admitting that everything he believed was a lie." His words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on Vanessa as the enemy that I had not fully considered what she represented. She was not simply evil. She was a product of a system shaped by forces that had been in motion long before she was born. That did not excuse her choices, but it complicated them in ways I had not anticipated. And it meant that Caleb was not just complicit, he was also a victim. Like Ralph, he had been slowly conditioned to accept manipulation as normal, to mistake control for love, to surrender his judgment to someone who used it against him. If I wanted to save my son, I could not simply expose Vanessa's crimes. I had to help him understand the entire pattern, the generational rot that had infected his marriage from the beginning. "She'll do this to his children too," I said slowly, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. "If they have kids, she'll raise them the same way Doris raised her. The cycle will continue." Ralph nodded miserably. "That's how it works. Each generation teaches the next, unless someone breaks the chain." I stood up and walked to the garage window, looking out at the house where my son slept beside a woman who was slowly destroying him. The anger I felt was still there, burning in my chest, but it had transformed into something colder and more focused. This was no longer just about protecting myself or reclaiming my dignity. This was about stopping a cycle that had been repeating for decades. "We don't just expose her actions," I said, my voice steady. "We expose the pattern, all of it. The mother, the grandmother, the history. Caleb needs to see the full picture." I turned to face Ralph, my resolve hardening into certainty. "He needs to understand that if he stays with her, his children will inherit this poison too. And I won't let that happen. Not to my grandchildren, not to my family." The decision to expose the full pattern required careful preparation. Over the following week, I worked with Jonathan to gather everything we would need. Margaret helped by retrieving additional county records and serving as a witness to conversations she had observed. Ralph, despite his fear, agreed to stand beside me when the moment came. We were assembling not just evidence, but a mirror that would force Vanessa to see herself clearly, perhaps for the first time in her life. I requested a family meeting through Caleb, framing it as a discussion about the living situation. I kept my tone reasonable, even conciliatory, suggesting that perhaps we could find an arrangement that worked for everyone. Vanessa agreed immediately, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She thought this was her opportunity to push the guardianship narrative, to paint me as a confused old man who needed supervision for his own good. She had no idea what was waiting for her. We gathered in the living room on a Saturday afternoon. Vanessa sat in the armchair she had claimed as her throne, her posture perfect, her expression arranged into careful concern. Caleb perched on the edge of the sofa beside her, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Ralph stood near the window, his face pale but determined. Margaret sat quietly in a corner chair, her presence explained as a concerned neighbor who wanted to help mediate. Jonathan arrived last, his briefcase in hand, introduced simply as an old family friend with legal experience. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly when she saw Jonathan, but she did not object. She was confident, I realized. She believed she had already won. "Thank you all for coming," I began, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I know there have been tensions in this household. I thought it might help if we addressed them openly with witnesses present to keep things civil." Vanessa nodded graciously. "I think that's wise, Leonard. We all want what's best for you." I let the condescension pass without reaction. Instead, I reached into the folder beside my chair and withdrew the first piece of evidence. Before we discuss the future, I think it's important to establish some facts about the present. I placed a photograph on the coffee table. It was a still image from the camera I had installed in the common area, perfectly legal as a co-owner of the property. The image showed Vanessa standing over me in the kitchen, her face contorted with anger, her finger jabbing toward my chest. "This was taken 3 weeks ago," I said. "The audio recording that accompanies it includes you calling me a worthless burden who should have died instead of Eleanor." Vanessa's composure flickered. "That's taken out of context." I was frustrated. "You can't possibly—" I placed a second photograph on the table, then a third. Each one captured a moment of verbal abuse, a snapshot of the cruelty she had hidden behind closed doors. "Context," I said quietly, "is exactly what I'm providing." Before she could respond, I withdrew the guardianship petition from my folder. Her face went white when she recognized it. "This document was hidden in your office," I continued. "It describes me as mentally incompetent and requests that you be granted control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my living arrangements. It was prepared without any medical evaluation, without my knowledge, and without any legal basis." Jonathan leaned forward. "For the record, filing a guardianship petition without proper medical documentation constitutes fraud. If this had been submitted to the court, it would have exposed Mrs. Blake to serious legal consequences." Vanessa's voice rose sharply. "That was for his protection. He's been confused lately, forgetting things, wandering around the house at night. I was trying to help him." "I have statements from 3 neighbors," Margaret said calmly, "confirming that Leonard has shown no signs of confusion or mental decline. I also have records of our conversations over the past month in which he has been articulate, organized, and completely aware of his circumstances." The room fell silent. Vanessa looked from face to face, searching for an ally, finding none. Even Caleb was staring at her with an expression I had not seen before. Doubt. I placed the final piece of evidence on the table. The emails between Vanessa and her mother, printed and dated, their contents damning beyond any possible explanation. "These emails document a pattern of financial manipulation that stretches back over a decade," I said. "They include instructions from your mother on how to exploit people who trust too easily. They describe what you did to Ralph's brother Thomas, and they reveal that this is not the first time you have destroyed a family from the inside." Vanessa snatched up the papers, scanning them frantically. "These are fake," she said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Someone fabricated these to frame me." Ralph stepped forward from his position by the window. His voice was quiet but steady. "I printed those emails myself, Vanessa, 15 years ago after what you did to Thomas. I've kept them ever since." She turned on her father with fury in her eyes. "You're lying. You've always been against me. You never supported me, never believed in me." "I believed in you too much," Ralph said sadly. "That was my mistake." Vanessa whirled back toward the room, her composure completely shattered. She pointed at me, at Margaret, at Jonathan, accusations tumbling over each other in a torrent of desperate deflection. The guardianship was for my own good. The emails were misunderstood. The cameras were an invasion of privacy. Everyone was conspiring against her. The more she talked, the more her lies contradicted each other. The more she defended herself, the more clearly her guilt emerged. I watched my son's face as he listened to his wife unravel, watched the terrible recognition dawn in his eyes as the woman he had married became a stranger before him. Finally, Caleb spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through Vanessa's tirade like a blade. "The loans," he said. His face was white as paper, his hands trembling in his lap. "The ones you took out in my name. The ones you said were for our future." Vanessa froze. "Where did that money really go, Vanessa?" Caleb's question hung in the air like a blade suspended above all our heads. The room had gone utterly still. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Vanessa's response. I watched her face cycle through a dozen expressions in the space of a heartbeat. Shock calculation, fear, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The relief of someone who no longer has to pretend. "You want to know where the money went?" Her voice was different now, stripped of the careful modulation she usually employed. Raw and sharp like a wound that had finally been lanced. It went to keeping this family afloat. It went to covering the gaps that you couldn't fill because you were too weak to ask for a raise, too passive to demand what you were worth. Caleb recoiled as though she had struck him. "Vanessa, I don't understand." "Of course you don't understand," she spat. "You've never understood anything. I've been managing everything for years. The bills, the investments, the planning for our future. And what thanks do I get? Accusations, suspicion. My own father siding with a senile old man who should have been put in a home months ago." She whirled toward me, her finger jabbing in my direction. "This is your doing. You poisoned them against me. You've been scheming since the day I moved you into that garage, waiting for a chance to destroy everything I've built." "Everything you've built?" I kept my voice level, refusing to match her fury. "I built half this house, Vanessa, literally. My name is on the deed." Her face went slack for just a moment before the rage flooded back. "That's impossible. Caleb told me—" "Caleb didn't know the details," I said calmly. "When he needed help buying this property 12 years ago, I co-signed the mortgage and provided the down payment. I've been a legal co-owner this entire time. You've been trying to throw me out of my own house." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Vanessa staggered slightly, her hand reaching for the armchair to steady herself, but she recovered quickly, pivoting toward her father with venom in her eyes. "And you," she hissed. Standing there pretending to be righteous. Where was this courage when I was growing up? Where was this moral backbone when Mother was teaching me how to survive in a world that gives women nothing unless they take it? Ralph flinched, but he didn't look away. "Your mother was wrong, Vanessa, and I was wrong for letting her teach you those things." "You were weak," Vanessa snarled. "You've always been weak. You let her walk all over you, and then you blamed her for your own failures. At least she had the strength to take what she needed. At least she wasn't a coward." The words seemed to strike Ralph somewhere deep. I watched something shift in his expression, a hardening that I had not seen before. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that silenced even Vanessa's fury. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was weak. I watched your mother hurt people, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I watched her raise you to do the same, and I convinced myself you would make different choices. I've failed you, Vanessa. I failed you by never teaching you that what she did was wrong." He stepped forward, and for the first time Vanessa seemed uncertain. She had expected him to crumble, to retreat into apologies and excuses as he always had. Instead, he stood before her with a clarity that decades of denial had finally burned away. "But I won't fail this family," he continued. "What you're doing is wrong. The manipulation, the fraud, the cruelty, it's wrong. And I won't be your excuse anymore. I won't let you blame your choices on me or on your mother or on anyone else. This ends here." He turned and walked toward the front door. Vanessa called after him, her voice cracking with something that might have been desperation. "Dad, wait. You can't just leave. After everything I've done for you." Ralph paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe. He did not turn around. "Goodbye, Vanessa," he said softly. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. She looked at Caleb, perhaps hoping to find some remnant of loyalty, but my son would not meet her eyes. He sat motionless on the sofa, his face a mask of devastation. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to whisper. Margaret had friends throughout the community, women who had observed Vanessa's behavior over the years and kept their concerns to themselves. Now those concerns found voice. Stories emerged of cutting remarks at community gatherings of charity events where Vanessa had taken credit for others' work of small cruelties witnessed through windows and over fences. The social standing she had cultivated so carefully began to crumble, each whispered conversation eroding another piece of the facade she had built. Vanessa retreated into the house, refusing to answer the door or return phone calls. Caleb moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding both his wife and me, processing the wreckage of everything he had believed about his marriage. 3 days after the family meeting, Jonathan called me with news. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone he used when delivering information he knew would change everything. "Leonard, I need you at my office tomorrow morning, early." "What is it?" I asked. There was a pause, and I heard papers shuffling on his end of the line. "My investigators have been looking into Caleb's financial records following the trail of those loans Vanessa mentioned. They found something unexpected." His voice grew grimmer. "There's a property. A house in another state purchased 2 years ago. The mortgage is in Caleb's name, but he's never seen it." My grip tightened on the phone. "Who owns it?" "The deed is registered to Vanessa's mother," Jonathan said. "Leonard, this is bigger than we thought. I'll explain everything tomorrow." Jonathan's office felt smaller than I remembered, the walls pressing in, as though the room itself understood the weight of what was about to be revealed. I arrived early the next morning, but Caleb was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Jonathan's desk. He looked like he had not slept in days, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched forward in a posture of defeat. When I entered, he glanced up briefly but said nothing. Whatever words existed between us would have to wait until we understood the full scope of what his wife had done. Jonathan closed the door behind me and took his seat. On his desk lay a stack of documents, each one flagged with colored tabs, organized with the meticulous precision I had come to expect from him. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "What I'm about to show you is the result of 2 weeks of investigation," he began. "I hired a forensic accountant to trace the loans that were taken out in Caleb's name. What we found is significantly worse than we initially suspected." He slid the first document across the desk. It was a loan agreement dated 3 years ago bearing Caleb's signature at the bottom. The amount was $50,000. "Do you remember signing this?" Jonathan asked. Caleb leaned forward, squinting at the document. His face went pale. I mean, it looks like my signature, but I don't remember this specific loan. Vanessa handled all the paperwork. She said it was routine stuff, refinancing documents, household authorizations. There are 4 more just like it," Jonathan said quietly. He spread the remaining loan agreements across the desk, each one bearing Caleb's signature, each one for a different amount. 50,000, 35,000, 60,000, 55,000. The total climbed higher with each page until the final number sat between us like an accusation. $200,000, Jonathan said. "All borrowed against your credit, your income, and in some cases your share of the house equity. All signed with what appears to be your hand, though I suspect you never read what you were signing." Caleb's hands were shaking. "She told me it was just paperwork, normal stuff that needed both signatures. I trusted her." "That trust was weaponized," Jonathan replied. "Vanessa obtained your signature on documents you didn't understand, then used those signatures to secure loans you never knew existed. That's fraud, Caleb. Criminal fraud." I watched my son absorb this information, watched the color drain from his face as the implications settled into his bones. But Jonathan was not finished. "The money from these loans didn't go into your household accounts," he continued. "It didn't pay for renovations or investments or anything you would have seen. My investigator traced the funds through a series of transfers designed to obscure their destination. They ended up in an account belonging to Vanessa's mother." He placed another document on the desk. This one was a property deed registered in another state showing a modest house purchased 2 years ago. The buyer was listed as Doris Hargrove. The mortgage payments, traced back through the labyrinth of transfers, came from the loans taken out in Caleb's name. "Vanessa has been funneling your family's assets to her mother for years," Jonathan said. "The house you're living in, the life you thought you were building, she's been hollowing it out from the inside, sending everything of value to a woman who taught her exactly how to do it." The silence that followed was devastating. I looked at my son and saw a man whose entire understanding of his marriage had just been demolished. Every financial struggle, every tight month, every conversation where Vanessa had assured him that money was simply difficult right now, all of it had been a lie. She had not been managing their finances, she had been draining them. "This is what she did to Ralph's brother," I said quietly. "The same pattern. She moves into a household, takes control of the money, and slowly transfers everything to accounts her family controls. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, there's nothing left." Caleb looked up at me, his eyes wet. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't anyone warn me?" The question cut deeper than he could have known. I had asked myself the same thing 1,000 times over the past weeks. Why had I stayed silent for so long? Why had I let my fear of confrontation override my duty to protect my son? Because I didn't have proof. I said honestly. And because you wouldn't have believed me. You would have defended her the way you always did. You would have seen me as the enemy, not her. I had to wait until you could see the truth for yourself. Caleb buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, though, whether from grief or rage, I could not tell. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps he was simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal, by the realization that the woman he had loved, the woman he had chosen over his own father, had never seen him as a partner at all. He was not her husband. He was her harvest. A crop to be cultivated and consumed, just as his Uncle Thomas had been, just as Ralph's father had been before that. Vanessa had married him not for love, but for access. Everything she had ever said, every moment of apparent tenderness had been part of a long con designed to extract maximum value before moving on. When Caleb finally lifted his head, his expression had changed. The confusion was still there, and the grief, but beneath them, I saw something I had not seen in years. Clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when every illusion has been stripped away and nothing remains but the raw truth. He looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper, and spoke the words I had been waiting years to hear. "Dad," he said, "what do I do now?" The question my son asked hung between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. What do I do now? It was the question of a man who had lost his footing, who had watched the ground he thought was solid crumble into nothing beneath his feet. I had waited years to hear him ask it, and now that the moment had arrived, I found that all the speeches I had rehearsed in my mind dissolved into something far simpler. Jonathan quietly excused himself, gathering his papers and stepping into the hallway to give us privacy. The door clicked shut, and suddenly it was just the two of us, father and son, alone for the first time in longer than I could remember. "I didn't do any of this to punish her," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "I did it so you could see clearly. What you do next is your choice, Caleb. It always has been." He stared at me, his eyes searching my face for something, accusation perhaps, or the righteous anger of a father who had been vindicated. But I had no interest in being right. I had only ever wanted my son back. "How can you say that?" His voice cracked. "After everything I let her do to you, after I watched her throw your belongings into the driveway, tear up your wedding photo, make you sleep in the garage like you were nothing, I stood there, Dad. I stood there and did nothing." "I know. I knew something was wrong." The words came faster now, tumbling out as though a dam had broken somewhere inside him. "I knew it for years. The way she talked to you, the way she controlled everything, the way she made me feel like I was crazy for questioning anything. But I was afraid. I was so afraid of what would happen if I confronted her, if I admitted that my marriage was built on lies. So I stayed quiet. I let her hurt you because I was too much of a coward to face the truth." He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his shoulders heaving with the force of years of suppressed guilt. I watched my son fall apart in that small office, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just an overwhelming tenderness for this broken man who had once been a boy I had carried on my shoulders. I stood and crossed the distance between us. Caleb looked up startled as I reached down and pulled him into an embrace. He resisted for just a moment, stiffening in surprise, and then he collapsed against me, his arms wrapping around my back, his face buried in my shoulder. I held him the way I had not held him since he was a child, when the monsters lived in closets and could be chased away with a nightlight and a father's reassurance. "Fear doesn't make you weak," I said quietly, my hand resting on the back of his head. "Every man feels fear. Every man faces moments when the truth is too heavy to carry alone. What matters is what you do with that fear. Choosing to stay afraid, choosing to let it paralyze you, that's what makes a man small. But you're not small, Caleb. You never were. You just forgot how to stand up. He pulled back, wiping his face with the heel of his hand, looking at me with an expression I had not seen in years. It was the look of a son who had finally found his father again. "What do we do now?" he asked again. But this time the question carried a different weight. It was not the plea of a lost man. It was the question of a partner ready to act. "We take back what's ours," I said, "together." Jonathan returned shortly after, and we spent the next hour working through the legal options. As co-owners of the property, Caleb and I had the right to request that any non-owner vacate the premises. Vanessa had no legal claim to the house. She had never been on the deed, never contributed to the mortgage in any documented way. Her presence in our home existed entirely at our discretion, and that discretion had reached its end. Jonathan prepared the formal notice, a document requesting that Vanessa leave the property within 30 days. It was not an eviction in the traditional sense. She was not a tenant, and we were not landlords. We were simply two property owners exercising our legal rights to determine who lived in our home. Caleb signed the document first, his hand steady, his jaw set with determination. Then he handed the pen to me, and I added my signature beside his. For the first time in years, we were standing on the same side. "I'll have this delivered tomorrow," Jonathan said, filing the document in his briefcase. "She'll have 30 days to find alternative arrangements. If she refuses to leave, we can pursue legal remedies, but I don't think it will come to that. People like Vanessa prefer to cut their losses and move on to the next opportunity." We thanked him and left the office together, walking side by side through the parking lot toward our cars. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I realized that for the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of dread pressing down on my shoulders. The battle was not over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. We drove home in separate cars, arriving within minutes of each other. As we walked up the driveway, I noticed that the front door was already open. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the dim interior of the house. She must have seen us pull in. She must have known something had changed. "Well," she said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. "The prodigal father and his newly enlightened son. Did you enjoy your little meeting with the lawyer?" Caleb stepped forward, the notice clutched in his hand. "Vanessa, we need to talk." She laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "Talk? After everything you've done, after you conspired with him to destroy our marriage." "You destroyed our marriage," Caleb said quietly. "I just finally opened my eyes." Vanessa's expression shifted, the mask of contempt sliding away to reveal something harder beneath. She looked at the document in his hand, at the signatures we had placed side by side, and her lips curved into a smile that made my blood run cold. "If I lose everything," she said slowly, "so will you, both of you." Vanessa's threat echoed in the air between us, sharp and venomous. Caleb stood frozen beside me, the notice still clutched in his hand, his newfound resolve wavering in the face of his wife's fury. I could see the old fear creeping back into his eyes, the conditioned response to her anger that years of manipulation had carved into his bones. He needed to be away from her. He needed space to remember who he had chosen to become. "Caleb," I said quietly, "why don't you give us a moment? There are things I need to say to her alone." He hesitated, looking between us, torn between his instinct to protect me and his desperate need to escape the woman who had controlled him for so long. I nodded reassuringly, and after a moment he retreated into the house, his footsteps fading down the hallway toward the back rooms. Vanessa watched him go, her lips curling with contempt. "Running away, that's all he's ever been good at." "He's not running," I said. "He's finally walking toward something instead of away from it." She turned her full attention to me, and I saw the rage building behind her eyes. This was the Vanessa who had hidden behind charm and calculation for years, the predator who had been exposed and cornered. There was nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think you've outsmarted me, turned my own husband against me, destroyed everything I've built. But you're nothing, Leonard. You're a pathetic old man who couldn't even hold on to his own house without hiding behind legal technicalities." I let her words wash over me without reaction. I had heard worse from her, and I had survived it all. "You pretended to be weak," she continued, her voice rising. "You shuffled around like a confused old fool, letting me think I had you under control. But you were scheming the whole time, weren't you? Manipulating everyone, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." I met her gaze steadily, and when I spoke, my voice carried no anger. only a quiet certainty that seemed to unsettle her more than any shout could have. "I've known about my ownership for 12 years, I said. "Since the day I signed the mortgage papers with Caleb, I knew exactly what rights I had, exactly what power I held. When you threw my belongings into the driveway, when you made me sleep in that garage, I could have stopped you at any moment." Her expression flickered with confusion. "Then why didn't you—" "Because I needed Caleb to see who you really are. Not through my words, not through my accusations, but through your own actions. If I had confronted you that first night, he would have defended you. He would have chosen you over me the way he always had. I needed him to witness the truth for himself without my interference." Vanessa stared at me, something shifting behind her eyes. "You planned all of this?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Planning is what you do. The guardianship petition, the fraudulent loans, the years of manipulation, that's planning. What I did was different. I waited, I watched. I let the truth surface on its own timeline. There's a difference between revenge and patience, Vanessa. You've never understood that." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa Blake had nothing to say. I stepped closer, close enough to see the fear beginning to bloom beneath her anger. She had spent her entire life controlling others, bending them to her will through charm or cruelty. She had never encountered someone who simply refused to be moved. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. "I thought I would. After everything you've done, I expected to feel rage or satisfaction or some kind of triumph, but I don't. What I feel is pity." Her jaw tightened. "I don't need your pity." "You were taught that love is weakness," I continued as though she had not spoken. "Your mother raised you to believe that control is safety, that trust is something to exploit, that the only way to survive is to take from others before they can take from you, and you learned those lessons well. You've controlled everything around you for years." I gestured at the empty hallway at the house that had become a battlefield, at the wreckage of the life she had built on lies. "But look around, Vanessa. You've controlled everything, and you've lost everything. Your husband, your father, your home, your future. That's not my doing. That's yours. The life you built was always going to collapse because it was built on a foundation of sand. I just stopped pretending to hold it up." She had no response. The rage had drained from her face, replaced by something hollow and defeated. I turned away, walking toward the kitchen where Caleb was waiting, leaving her standing alone in the doorway of a house that would never be hers. A knock at the front door stopped us both. Vanessa opened it reflexively, and 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their expressions professionally neutral. "Vanessa Blake?" the first officer asked. She nodded, confusion and alarm warring on her face. He extended a manila envelope. "You've been served. Your husband has filed a civil lawsuit for financial fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of personal credit. You'll find the details inside." The envelope hung in the air between them. Vanessa took it with trembling hands, her face draining of color as the full weight of consequence finally arrived at her door. The days following Vanessa's departure passed in a strange kind of quiet. She left within a week of being served, packing her belongings into a rental car and driving away without a word to anyone. Caleb watched from the window as she pulled out of the driveway for the last time, his expression unreadable. I stood beside him but said nothing. Some endings do not require commentary. They simply are. The lawsuit moved forward through the proper channels, Jonathan, guiding us through each step with the calm precision I had come to rely on. Vanessa's mother was named as a co-defendant, the property she had purchased with stolen money, now subject to seizure and sale. The legal system, for all its slowness, was grinding toward justice, but I found that I thought about it less and less as the weeks passed. The battle was over. What remained was the work of rebuilding. 3 weeks after Vanessa left, Jonathan called me to his office. His voice on the phone carried a weight I did not recognize, something between solemnity and anticipation. When I arrived, he was standing by his window looking out at the street below, a manila envelope resting on his desk. "Sit down, Leonard," he said. "There's something I've been holding for a long time, something I was instructed to give you only when the moment was right." I lowered myself into the familiar leather chair, my eyes fixed on the envelope. It was old, the edges slightly worn, my name written across the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Eleanor's handwriting. "Your wife gave this to me years ago," Jonathan said quietly. before she passed. She made me promise to give it to you only when you had already stood up on your own. She said you would know when the time was right." He paused, his voice softening. "I think this is that time." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. The seal had never been broken. Whatever Eleanor had left for me had waited patiently through all the years of grief, through the slow erosion of my dignity, through the long journey back to myself. It had waited because she had known I would need it only after I had found my own strength. Inside, I found documents, copies of everything: the deed to the house ownership records, financial account statements, insurance policies, all notarized, all protected, all organized with the meticulous care that had defined everything Eleanor did. She had prepared a complete legal backup of our entire lives together, a fortress of paper that would have protected me against any assault. Beneath the documents lay a single sheet of paper covered in her familiar script. "My dearest Leonard," she had written, "if Jonathan has given you this envelope, it means you have already done what I always knew you could do. You have stood up, you have fought back, you have reclaimed your dignity without needing anyone to rescue you." I had to stop reading. My vision had blurred and I realized that tears were streaming down my face. I wiped them away and forced myself to continue. "I knew you would find your strength. This is just my backup in case the world was crueler than I hoped. I never doubted you, Leonard. Not for a single moment. I only wanted to catch you if you fell. But I see now that you didn't need catching. You needed time. And perhaps you needed to believe that you were standing alone, so that when you finally stood, you would know it was your own legs holding you up." The letter ended with words that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "I'm so proud of you. I always was. I always will be." Months passed. Spring arrived, and with it the slow work of restoration. Caleb and I spent our weekends repairing the house, fixing all the small damages that had accumulated over years of neglect. We replaced rotted boards on the porch, repainted the trim-planted flowers in the garden that had grown wild. We did not talk much while we worked, but the silence between us was comfortable, now filled with the quiet understanding of two men who had found their way back to each other. Margaret became a regular presence at our Sunday dinners, bringing pies and casseroles and the warmth of genuine friendship. She had been there when no one else was, and neither Caleb nor I would ever forget it. Ralph wrote letters to Vanessa, long handwritten pages that he sent to the address she had reluctantly provided. He hoped that someday she would understand, that someday she might choose a different path. I did not share his optimism, but I respected his need to try. Some fathers never stop reaching for their children, no matter how far they have fallen. On a quiet Sunday evening, I placed Eleanor's restored photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. Beside it, I set both of her letters, the first one I had found in the garage, and the second one that Jonathan had kept safe for years. They belonged together, two halves of a message that had taken me far too long to fully hear. For the first time in years, I felt life returning to me not as a burden, but as a gift. My wife had not just loved me, she had believed in me, protected me, and waited for me to find my own strength. Some people leave behind money. Eleanor left behind something better. She left behind faith. And so the story of Leonard Blake comes to a close, not with vengeance, but with something far more powerful: the quiet triumph of a man who refused to let anyone steal his dignity. He lost his wife, nearly lost his son, and spent cold nights in a garage surrounded by the broken pieces of his life. But he never lost himself. He waited, he watched, and when the moment came, he stood up with the strength that Eleanor had always known was there. Vanessa thought she could erase him. She thought kindness was weakness and patience was surrender. She was wrong. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is wait for the truth to reveal itself. And sometimes the people who love us most leave behind exactly what we need, even when we do not know we need it yet. This story is dedicated to everyone who has ever felt pushed aside, underestimated, or forgotten by the people who should have protected them. You are not alone. Your dignity belongs to you, and no one has the right to take it. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when no one else would? Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was protecting you from beyond the grave? We read every single comment, and your words mean more to us than you know. Thank you for staying until the very end. Until next time, remember, some people leave behind money, but the ones who truly love us leave behind faith.